David Weicker. I am one of the coordinators of the WPA group, Event Leaders Group. And I am very pleased to announce that we have two excellent speakers tonight, both ITOs and both with tons of experience relating to throws, both seated and otherwise, for para athletes. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Louise. Louise Buscus is an ITO, and she's going to take over from here.
Okay, my screens aren't cooperating, so if I'm disorientated, that's not a problem. So we're going to talk about throws, and I always like to throw in a little useless bit of information. Never useless, but always interesting. And now I wasn't doing it. Frickin' technology is not my friend today. There we go. So 1948, England's sports competition, they started a sports competition for soldiers who were learning how to cope with the disabilities that they had received once they were in World War II. And that the really cool part that I liked about this useless bit of information is in 2017, the World Championships attendance for that meet eclipsed all other championships combined, which is like, it was massive. And where was it held? In London, England. So it was just kind of cool that it started in England, and its pinnacle up to this point was back in England. Yeah, there's my useless bit. So we're going to talk about throws, everything you need to know about para throws. So first thing we're going to talk about is the visually impaired, and I did this screen up obviously thinking of visually impaired. And I don't know why I said, oh yeah, we are F11s and 13s. F meaning field, the 1 meaning vision impaired, and 1 to 3 meaning the degree of impairment. So first of all, we're going to talk about the 11s, which they're at the lowest number, which means they are totally blind. So they must have an assistant for throws. It's not an option, they have to have one. So the purpose of that assistant, and you can see the arrow pointing to the assistant behind them. So they're orientating them in the circle, pointing out to them, where the sector is, and then possibly, or orientating them audio to what direction is they're throwing. The athlete themselves must wear eye patches covering their eyes and a mask or opaque glasses like this athlete's wearing. So the mask or the glasses, they can remove that in between throws if they want. But the eye patches must remain on the whole time they're on field of play. The opaque glasses can be inspected in the call room or at the end of the competition or anytime in between. And usually the referee does that. I thought disappeared. Could have been important. Oh, yes. The other thing is you look for is if it looks like they're trying to see out through the bottom of their glasses or something, yeah, you need to be checking that, make sure their patches are in place, make sure the glasses are opaque. So to talk about the different parts of it, we talked about the 11s already, right? So they're totally blind. They must have an assistant, but they're only allowed one. They must wear the eye patches and they can be inspected. So the 12s, which are partially sighted, they're what we would refer to as legally blind. So they can have an assistant if they want one, but they don't have to have one. That depends on their level of confidence of being out there. Eye coverings are not required. Again, quite often they wear the dark glasses, but that's only a personal preference. They do not have to have them. might require assistance from an official to put their marks down if they're not coming out there with an assistant. So they may come out with a piece of paper saying, hey, this is where my mark is, or they may tell you, hey, can you put a mark here for me? The third classification we have within visually impaired are the F13s, and they have partial vision. And so basically not a lot different than able-bodied. The only difference would be that they might require assistance with putting their marks down. So orientation for that assistant who brings them out. The assistant may bring the athlete to the throwing circle. They may orientate him before each attempt, but they must leave the area before the attempt begins. They can provide acoustic orientation if they want, before, during, after, whatever. That they can say whatever they want. Athletes can also be escorted off after the throw is completed. It's got to be a fully completed throw, and then the assistant can come back into the circle and help them come out, or the cage, or whatever. The official in charge, referee, if the referee's not around, the chief, they have the right to move the assistants if they feel that they are standing in an unsafe location. Most of these assistants, I've done this many times, they know where they need to be standing, but every now and then you get a new one, they might not be aware. Also, don't forget that the most of those assistants are their coaches. So you got to watch that they are seated somewhere besides, then right beside the athlete, so that they're not coaching. Timing. Okay, so the timing, the countdown time clock shall begin from the moment when the official is satisfied that the athlete has completed the orientation process, and usually that's when the assistant leaves the circle. The athletes can ask for confirmation if it's time to start. The clock can stop if the athlete loses orientation for some reason, then the clock is stopped. Never reset, but it's stopped. Once the athlete is reorientated, then it's reset, or then it's started again, not reset. I lost the markings here, Jerry. I don't know whose is whose.
I'm pretty sure this is yours.
Okay. So moving on to the next classification is the 40-41s. These are athletes of short stature. 41s, obviously being a little shorter, different impairments. So these athletes have absolutely no variations to the World Athletics rules. Same rules apply to them as it does to able-bodied. I think this one was for you, Jerry, to go through this.
Okay, all right. The classification system for World Para-Athletics is an essential component of it, and it applies to many sports that are sponsored and governed by IPC. The main reason for it is we group athletes with disabilities by the effect of that disability on their functional capacity for performing the movements of their individual sports. And we have these groups available to us to put athletes into them so that they compete with other colleagues that have similar disabilities. So the F20s, the field 20s, are intellectually impaired, and they undergo certain testing. They have to have been identified as intellectually impaired before their 18th birthday. The F35s through 38s, typically cerebral palsy or other traumatic brain injury that might have had a similar impact on them. These athletes are somewhat uncoordinated in their movements. One thing I'll say here before I go further is that typically, like Louise said before, the lower the number, the more functionally impaired the athlete is. This may be a little bit different in CP, but the 38s are the most functional and most typical with other ambulatory athletes in their function. The 42s through 44s, it's a lower limb deficiency. Their lower limbs don't work properly. They don't have amputation, but the functional effect of their disability on their lower limbs is similar to what one might see with an amputation. The 45s through 47s are the upper limbs. So the 45s would be up higher on the limbs, and the 47s would be down near the wrist. And this can be with or without amputation. Somewhat more recent classification that we've developed is the 61s through 64s. The F61s and 62s are lower extremity above the knee amputations, and the 63s and the 64s are lower extremity below the knee amputations, either single or double. Louise, go ahead and change that. I'm not running. I'm on your time. Many of these athletes may need their markers to be preset for them. For the intellectually impaired, the F20s, sometimes they get a little bit confused or may not quite understand exactly where and how they may need to set the markers. And that also can involve something like starting blocks, which we'll talk about in a second. The 35s and through 38s, due to coordination issues, it sometimes is difficult for them to set their markers as well. So we will allow the officials to help them setting out their markers, either around the circle or out there on the runway for the long jump. 42s and 44s, it's difficult for them to bend over and lay markers down on the ground with any kind of accuracy, and being able to look at the tape and see if they're placing them in the right place. Little bit more functional, the upper extremity amputees, but as you can imagine, if you don't have any arms, it's kind of difficult to grab a hold of markers and place them appropriately. And the 61s through 64s, especially the 61s and 62s, who are bilateral above and below the knee, have stability issues, and bending over with those prosthetic limbs is quite a difficult process. Next. For field, as you can see in this picture, this gentleman is using a left-sided lower limb below the knee prosthetic, and he has chosen to do that. He's allowed to make it, it's his choice. However, one important point here is that once he or she has chosen to use their prosthetic limb when throwing or performing, they must use that prosthetic limb throughout the entire event. Next. Now, some of our athletes, as you can imagine, those athletes who get around normally in day-to-day level in wheelchairs, are going to not compete standing, but compete seated. And in World Para Athletics, our athletes compete in a somewhat standardized chair. In other words, there are certain measurements that the chair must comply with, but it provides them with a stable platform from which to throw. So the F31s and 34s, they go all the way up to 38, remember, but the 31s and 34s are those that are in chairs, and they compete seated. The 51s through 57s, these athletes are typically spinal cord injuries, maybe spina bifida. They can have limb deficiencies, certainly muscle impairments, and they also compete seated. So this pool of athletes are what we call the seated throws athletes, and they require a unique set of rules that we'll talk about a little bit later. Go ahead, Louise. I think you bumped it too, didn't you?
What did I do?
Yeah, there you go. Like I said, the throwing frame has certain specifications. You can see this frame here and this gentleman throwing the javelin from a seated platform that's tied into a frame in an existing circle on the field of play. The measurements of the chair are standardized. This vertical pole can be used for some for athletes who wish to use that to stabilize themselves. There's certain unique rules that apply to that. The pole can't bend and can't store energy to help the athlete move themselves forward during the throw. The entire chair, including any attachments to the chair, must be inside the vertical plane of the circle. However, that does not mean that feet and straps and things like that can't be outside of the circle, but the frame, all parts of the frame must be within that vertical plane of the circle. And the kind of strapping that people use, as you can see here, he's got leg straps and straps around his lower limbs there. Sometimes they'll tie them to the chair to keep them stable. Go ahead, Louise. Here's an example. Go ahead. Yes, this is yours.
Okay, so throwing frames. So all the inspections and the measurings of the frames must happen without the athlete in the chair. So at major competitions, ever since the rules of the chairs changed or frames changed, we always do a pre-inspection to make sure everything is legal, so they don't get out, go on field of play and go, oh my gosh, my chair's not legal, I can't compete. So we do a courtesy pre-check, which is becoming not as used as much. Tokyo is the example. We checked a lot of frames, but then once we got to competition, we realized that the number of frames that there was there, we checked only a fraction of what the frames were there. So people are becoming more confident of their frames are legal. Even still, we encountered illegal ones. Anyhow, to review some of the criteria, the maximum height of the frame, including the cushions, they can't exceed 75 centimeters. And this is something you got to be careful about, because it happens that the chair will come to the call room, which is where it is officially inspected, or a call room area. So it's inspected, yeah, it's below 75 centimeters. The frame will come out onto field to play, the athlete will throw a cushion on it. So then if you're out on field to play, you need to, you know what, before the athlete gets on it, measure it again to make sure that chair doesn't put them over the 75 centimeters, because it will on occasion. The seating area has to be square or rectangular, has to be at least 30 centimeters on each side, which, yeah, I've never seen it that it's smaller than that. They want it bigger. So they can have a notch, and I thought one of these chairs don't see it. They can have a notch in the seat if that's where their holding frame is, to hold it in place. Just let me go ahead on these other slides. We might see it on another slide. So it's okay. It doesn't have to be perfectly square. There can be notches out of it. And it must be level or inclined backwards. It can't be higher on the back than it is on the front, because that creates an advantage. Which brings an interesting point. And we had several chairs in Tokyo that did that. So our solution was, we used water bottle caps, and we placed them on the fronts of the chairs, so it created a slight slope to the back, made the chairs legal. There was one incident where we couldn't do it because then it created over the 75 centimeters. So you be creative. We try to help the athletes, give them advice when it comes to the frames, but whatever, that's the rules are, that's what it has to be. So all parts of the frames have to be fixed. Nothing can be articulating, they can't be flexible. the frames can have sides on them. They can have backs on them. And that is personal preference for each athlete's abilities and where it might be just for their comfort. It might help give them some stability for them to throw. Every individual is different, so that has to be different. So they can have those backs, they can be cushions, but they cannot exceed 5 centimeters thick. And again, this is a common infraction with these throwing frames, is they got padding, but it's too thick. So you can see that this athlete has applied duct tape to get it down to less than the 5 centimeters. And the biggest thing is those rests can't impede the judge's view of is there lifting, right? If those sides are solid all the way down, so you can't possibly see if they're lifting, then it's not a legal frame and they can't use it. They can have foot plates on there if they want, but they are only used for support or stability. Again, back in the day, the foot plates were used to help them throw. Now they can only just be there to, support their legs or whatever or sometimes it's to hold their feet back, whatever the case may be. Holding bars are fun. So they're allowed to have a holding bar. It's got to be straight, a single bar. It can't have joints. It can't articulate. And it may have layers of tape to help them give them a grip. So the bar may bend during a throw, but it must not be flexible to the naked eye. These things flex. They can't help but flex, but it can't flex any great amount. The rules were amended a little bit that they can now put that cross piece in to give it a little bit more stability. If you got an athlete that's flexing, you can just tell them, hold the bar lower down. Right? If it's flexing too much, if they hold that bar lower down, then it might eliminate it. It is a big problem for some of these athletes with strong upper body muscular. They got strength. They flex those bars. So, and again, considered an advantage. We're trying to level the playing field. So it can't. And if you can somehow, when to judge it, if you can line it up so you can line it up with something in the distance that's like on the edge of a building, or if it's within the cage, then line it up with a pole on the cage. It's easy to judge if it's flexing too much. Look at that, just what I just said. So incidental movement cannot be eliminated. It is acceptable. It's only when it gives them an advantage. And this isn't the video here, but we will show a video in a bit that helps explain that to you. So these chairs are examined in the call room, but they can be re-examined on the site if you feel that there is a need to. There is nothing wrong with that. And again, they can be remeasured, whatever, after field of competition. I think this picture of all these was Pan Am Games in Toronto.
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah, so you can see it's got the throwing frames on the one side and then the racing frames on the other. Massive room. So throwing circles. I think this one is yours, Jerry? Is it mine?
Sure. The use of this is we used circles pretty much any distance between the hammer size circle and the shot put size circle to be able to throw from in a seated chair. We don't have to use an existing concrete circle. We can place the chair and paint a circle that essentially gives us what we need, because these athletes are sitting down and they're not gonna, they're not gonna touch the toe board or anything like that. As long as the entire chair is inside the circle, we're okay. These diagrams just kind of illustrate one method. A lot of newer tracks that are putting in field facilities actually put bolts in the ground so that we can put frames across these circles and then use those frames as tie down points to be able to stabilize throwing chairs for our athletes.
And in
Nick?
Canada, that's pretty well all we have.
Is
we
it?
have,
Okay.
yeah.
Cool.
I haven't seen Langley's, but most places that I've been, this is what we got.
Perfect. Here's an example of a couple of platforms. The upper one is an existing throwing circle, and you're using, and many people will use existing angle iron, stake them into the ground and run it across there. That's one method to do it. The more permanent method, obviously, is drilling holes in it, and then you can bolt these things down and make them quite stable. For those events that are not necessarily higher level, often these platforms can be made of wood, and a frame could be built around it. And what you see here, this semicircle represents the front arc of the circle. In seated throws, you don't really need the whole circle. All you need is that front line from which a tape can be dragged across at the from the point of the impact of the implement through the center, which would be right about in here, and be measured. And the idea behind this is you can use stakes to stabilize this. Sometimes people are known to place weightlifting weights on top of that. You can imagine that a big 250-pound gentleman who's very, very strong and is throwing very, very hard might have the capability of perhaps moving this platform. So great care is taken to make sure it's stabilized.
Which is exactly what happened when we were in Chile, right? They had platforms like this, and the big boys got out there and the whole platform was lifting.
Oh yeah. One problem with using wood too is that if the ground is wet or it's raining, these things will get wet and they tend to warp a little bit too. So you have to be careful with them. A lot of countries who build other frames, as you can see here, they're made of aluminum or galvanized steel, and they work quite well. Over here on the bottom right on this particular picture is a unique platform. We allow, according to the rules, an athlete to use their everyday chair as long as the chair meets the criteria in terms of measurements, height and width of the seat, etc. And in order to attain that 75 centimeter height, we allow the athletes to have a slightly elevated ramp upon which they can push their chair up onto it, or with an assistant help them get their chair up onto it and then tie it down from there. And you as an official, your job is to make sure that once they're on top of that, the top of the cushion does not exceed that 75 centimeter limit. But it's a unique device. It provides individuals who don't have the wherewithal to get a specialized chair for throwing to use what they have.
And also sometimes difficult to get that measurement because you can't do it with the athlete in the chair.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Doing it in the middle of competition is difficult because then you would have to get the athlete out of the chair, because that sitting on that cushion compresses the cushion, of course, and may make it legal. But once the athlete is out of the chair, the cushion expands and may exceed that 75 centimeters. This is a chart out of the rule book. And the point of this chart really is that when you're officiating seated throws, one really, really important thing, and I find it most notable on the shot put, is to make sure that you provide the athlete with the correct weight implement. As you can imagine, athletes with more significant functional limitation due to their disability, they might be allowed to throw a lighter weight implement than, say, someone who does have a functional limitation, but it's not as significant as everybody else. They would be only allowed to throw the heavier weight implements. In terms of the shot put, you can see here there's the 3K and the 4K. I've personally seen from Polanic a 3K and the 4K of the same diameter and the same color, and you can imagine the chaos that might cause in the event. So it's very, very important that you note on the flight sheet what the size of the implement is for that athlete, for that event, and make sure that the stamp on the athlete on the implement is legible, so you can give the athlete the correct implement. You don't want them setting a world record with an implement that's too light. That's rather embarrassing. For F31s and 33s and F51s through 54s are seated. These athletes are a subset of the seated throws athletes. Their functional impairment is more severe. They are permitted to have an assistant to come out with them onto the field of play and help them make the transfer from their everyday chair into the field chair. One important point, however, is these assistants are not allowed to coach. They are there to help the athlete get in a position to where they can perform the throws during the event. Classes 34, 55 through 57, they have to, the rest of these seated throws athletes, they have to make the transfer by themselves, and then they have to do all the strapping by themselves as well. Whereas the others, in addition to help with the transfer, the assistant, I forgot to say, is allowed to help them strap the athlete to the chair. I'll say at this point here, you should note the yellow straps that are tying the chair to the platform, that is the job of the officials to do that. And we'll talk about the issue with that here in just a moment.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Louise.
Yeah, to explain what's happening in this picture, the official here is cautioning this coach to, he's the assistant, but guess what? He's the coach. So he's warning him that you cannot coach while you're in the circle.
Very good point. By rule, strapping must be only to the frame. In other words, the athlete can't tie them to other straps that are tying the frame to the ground. And they must be non-elastic. In other words, any straps that you use cannot store energy that might somehow be used to facilitate the throw. Typically, a reasonable amount of time by the officials is allocated to secure the throwing chair, throwing frame to the platform. This is our job as officials, but we try and do a good job of it with the assistance of the athlete or their assistant to get it in a position to where the athlete wants it. And here's some pictures of the parts of the frame. As you can see, this young athlete on the left is sitting. The frame is mostly inside that circle, but just from the viewpoint of this camera, it's difficult for me to clearly tell whether that vertical bar is completely inside the circle. It may indeed very well be. We're just in awkward view. But you can see also that her legs and her feet are sticking out beyond the vertical plane of that front arc, which is totally allowed within the rules. Gentleman over here on the right is one of our US athletes. Interestingly, probably 2 hours before this event took place, you can see he's got a brace wrapped around his leg and it's fixated where it's sticking way out in front. That's perfectly legal. What happened to him is he fell out of his wheelchair and broke his leg. And his docs on his team and everybody braced him up, wrapped him up, and got him out there. And as I recall, I believe he got a silver medal out of that. Next. Athletes in the 51 through 53, again, the more severely impaired athletes in the 50s classes. Often what happens, especially in the 51s and 52s, but to a certain degree, the 53s, what happens is their ability to flex their hands and their fingers around an implement, or in this case, for them to hold on to a vertical bar to stabilize themselves is very difficult because their hand won't come sliding off of it with any kind of force. So what we allow them to do is do two things. They can wear a glove on their hand for the vertical bar, not the throwing hand, but the hand that's holding on to the bar. We also allow them to tape their hand to the bar if they so choose to do so. This really provides them to stabilize their bodies and be able to make a throw. and provides them from assistance they might not otherwise have. Go ahead. The process of doing seated throws is a timed event, and there are multiple different processes, starting from allowing the orientating the chair to kind of sound like a Canadian there, orienting the chair to suit the athlete. And then our job, of course, is to tie the chair down, and then that chair is offered to the athlete, and the athlete has a certain amount of time, depending on their disability class, to get from their day chair onto the throwing chair and make as many throws as they wish to take. So there's no set number of throws, but there is a set amount of time to make that transfer and get that done. And of course, the more severely impaired athletes have an assistant to help them make that transfer. For the more functional classes, the 32s and 34s, that's in the CP group. And in the spinal cord injury group, the 54s through 57s, note that these are the higher numbers in those groups. They're more functional, and they get 4 minutes to do the transfer and throw all their warm-up throws. Whereas the more severely impaired athletes, the F31s, lower numbers, and the 51s through 53s on the spinal cord side, get 5 minutes. They get a little bit more time to accomplish those tasks.
So to point out this picture, this is at a junior development meet in the States. So really cool how they do it, because there's that like 13 pits going simultaneously around a ball diamond. It's just a cool setup. So they have, again, they just have that semicircle set up here to just give the line so that they know where to set the chairs.
No, for sure. And there are manufacturers that make these aluminum circles for athletic events. You can basically, they come in 3 pieces, typically from Gill. And all you really need is just one piece of that sector out in the front. And then you draw the lines out and you're ready to go. And as you can see, his chair is definitely behind the vertical plane of that painted on circle.
And this athlete also created some interesting situations for judges, because he had no legs, he had no hips, he had nothing to hold him, to help tie him down, to secure him to the frame so he wouldn't move. So when he would throw, especially to the discus, he slid. I mean, he really didn't lift, but he slid. So you got to really be watching when you're starting to judge lifting, which we'll talk a little bit more about.
A couple of unique bits of information about here. Should the athlete not be ready to compete after their warm-up time expires? It does happen, especially for the more severely impaired athletes. They just don't have enough time to get everything done. You as a judge or chief judge and should lead your team. And what you would do is, once you've indicated to the athlete that their time is up, tell them that they can continue getting ready, but you start the clock for the first throw. You let that clock run through the 1 minute per throw, which is what we use for seated throws. Once the athlete completes that, if they are ready to go, then you allow them to proceed with their the remaining throws that they have.
And sometimes it's because I've seen it that it's their chairs aren't there, they're not getting tied in right, whatever. So it's
It's a good point. We'll talk about it here more in a second. What you do need to know is that it is the athlete's responsibility to ensure that their equipment is in functional order. It is also their responsibility for them to strap themselves to the chair. So it's not our responsibility like it is tying the chair down to the frame. So if they are having issues with that, it's not something we're in control of them. So they're required to make sure that they can get everything done in order for them to compete.
Yep. You're going to see it in newer athletes that just aren't used to it yet. That's what we're going to see in Canada. What we see internationally, it's coming from maybe not as developed countries that they just don't have the depth in their organization, and they just, yeah, they're just not prepared. Anyhow, so for seated throws, again, obviously it's quite the procedure to get the chair in place, get the athlete in place. So we don't go through it like we normally do for throws. They throw 6 throws in a row. And after each throw, we measure. We do I talk about? Yes. So then they throw, but after, and then after each 1 minute is allowed for each throw, just like you do for any other athlete. But between the 3rd and the 4th, halfway through, we allow them 1 extra minute to take a brief rest. I mean, think of sitting there and chucking a javelin 6 times in a row. A lot of work. So we're going to give them that 1 minute break in between the 3rd and the 4th throw. The assistant can bring them some water, or if it's hot, they bring them a towel, whatever the case may be. And then that's also when, again, if the assistant is the coach, then they come over, then they're allowed to coach. If the coach is up in the stands, then they're yelling at them, just like you would with an able body. It gives them that opportunity to converse. They don't have to take that full minute, and most of the time they don't. So if they want to say, I'm done, I'm ready to go, then that's fine. And the same thing for each consecutive throw. There's a lot of times they're going to say, no, give me the implement. You present the implement. You, as an official, you walk up, you present the implement. They don't have to take it if they don't want to. When they're ready, then they can take it, but it's still part of the time. As soon as that implement is presented to them, the clock starts. So things that we're going to watch for when, as we're judging, it's the action. So it's the rules that apply to able body. It's the same thing. It's the things that we're watching for, the landing of it, make sure that it's a put, not a throw. We're watching that vertical bar isn't moving too much. We're watching for lifting, which is loss of contact with the seat, which we'll talk more about in a minute. We better speed up. And we're also judging to make sure that the throw is landing in the sector like we do for anybody else. One interesting thing to note is that an F32 athlete does not have the control over their lateral motion. So we allowed a concession that shot put can dip down slightly. Just so you know that if you see Sarah Mickey at national championships, she is not an F32 and is not allowed the lateral movement. So this is kind of what we were referring to before. So if the chains or the straps or whatever there is securing the chair to the platform breaks, that's on us. Right? That's our fault. We're supposed to be doing that. So at that point, if something happens, the athlete has the choice. They can get another throw or they can take the result. So obviously, if they had a good throw, they're going to take the result. If they had a bad one, the same thing. If no foul occurs because of the securing of the chair's responsibilities, blah, blah, just what I just said. Okay, moving on. So able-bodied athletes, if they want to foul their mark, they intentionally walk out the front of the circle. Well, these guys are seated, they really don't have a lot of options. So it's granted that if they touch the strapping outside of the circle, then it's a failure. We don't measure the throw. That was it. Oh, no, just stop for questions. Is there questions up to this point?
Can you back up 2 screens, Louise?
This one?
There. Okay, back up 1 more. Okay, good. Yeah, now forward. This one you didn't talk about.
Oh, right. So if the straps break holding the athlete on the chair, that's on them, right? So it's measured as usual. There's no option to a repeat throw. So if their strap breaks and they don't have a really good throw, too bad, so sad, that's their throw. If they lift because their strapping broke, then it's a failure. That's on them to provide the proper working equipment. It's sad, but that's the rules. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
I think this is a video. Is it not?
I think it might be. You won't say what he said.
So the question would be, did the bar move? Yeah, you can see that great big frame. The bar didn't move. The whole blade frame moved.
Yeah, I think the point of this one, Louise, was if you play the video one more time and watch the vertical bar. When he throws, that vertical bar is moving excessively, and we would normally call that a foul. However, if you look at it and run it one more time, Louise.
Yeah.
Watch the platform.
Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah, so they don't really have enough weight on that platform to prevent the platform from moving. He's a big boy.
Yeah. So again, this is the corollary of what we said before, right? This is on us. We're not providing a secure enough platform, a secure enough tie down for him. Hence, that's kind of creating the flexing. So that's on us, not on him.
Watch the vertical bar.
Yeah, not much doubt on that one. And again, easy to judge because that box is behind and you got a perfect thing to line it up against. Like that's more than incidental flexing. That's
Right.
definite foul.
Above and beyond the fact that he shot put came away from his chin.
Oh yeah, there's that.
Yeah, he's
So,
not
but
of
to
a
me,
class where
this
we
is-
would allow that to take place.
Right. So a perfect example of so many things that you need to be judging for a throws event.
Yeah.
You need a lot of bodies out there watching.
Yeah.
Now this is the fun stuff. This is you, Jerry.
Okay. Indeed, seated throws is one of the more difficult officiating from an officiating standpoint for us to participate in and make rulings. And I think you can break it down into 3 different things that you need to worry about, especially if you're a chief judge and trying to coordinate your crew. You want to position your judges appropriately so they can observe what they need to be observing. They need to watch the athlete. Preferably, you watch what the athlete is doing their warm-ups, so you have a good idea what his or her body movements are. We've mentioned lifting, and I think there's some videos about lifting here coming up. Basically, the athlete is not allowed to elevate their body above the platform on which they're sitting. You can understand from a physics standpoint, if you elevate the height of your hand when you throw an implement, it's going to go just a little bit further. So we don't allow that. That means that the athlete's legs and buttocks must remain on the seat of the chair from the time that they throw the implement to the time that the implement lands. Once that takes place, the athlete can move around as much as they want. So observing the legs and the buttocks during all phases of the throw, not only the throw itself, but the preparatory phase. You want to make sure that the buttocks, or a particular part of the buttocks known as the ischial tuberosities, those elements can't lift off the seat. You must remain seated. It is a call that is not something that you can measure, so it can be difficult to make a good, accurate call, speaking from experience. Also, as you can see from this diagram, which is a diagram out of the rule book, you can see that the skeletal athlete is here, and that's the pelvis, and the very bottom of the pelvis where that red arrow point is the ischial tuberosity. From that point forward, all the way up to the very back of the knee must be against the top of the cushion, and then with respect to the knee must be against the front of a cushion to meet the definition of being seated. That's the essential piece. You must be seated. So the leg from that ischial tuberosity to the back of the knee, and the part of the knee that's in front of the cushion must be against that cushion during that period of time that the implement is in flight until it lands. Go ahead, Louise. As I indicated, lifting is basically a foul. Technically, you're cheating by elevating your body above the seat of the cushion, potentially allowing for a slightly longer throw. And like I just described, those points are from the bottom of the pelvis when the athlete is seated vertically, all the way up to the back of the knee. You can see in the diagram to the right, now there is a space between the back of the knee and the front of that cushion, and his or her buttocks are on top of the cushion. This is still a lifting foul because not all of the leg is on top of the cushion, because there's that gap in the front there. So that is part of the overall rule that you need to be aware of. And that's a lot to keep track of. Not only are you watching the throw, you're watching the buttocks and you're watching the back of the knees. So a good chief judge coordinates his team so he or her, she has everybody watching and looking for different things and making sure that they make accurate calls.
Want to talk about our hint?
One point on the bottom here, sorry. It's difficult to really kind of have an idea when an athlete is sitting in their chair where that prominence at the bottom of the pelvis really is. And one hint you can use, if the athlete is capable, you can ask them to lay all the way down with their chest on top of their knees. And if you look at their buttocks, and that skin, that fleshy part of the buttocks will be stretched across the bone, and the point of contact on the chair in that position is going to be roughly right about where that ischial tuberosity is. So that can give you kind of a hint if you're not quite sure.
The other thing is to also remember that a number of these athletes have a lot of extra flesh. And if that flesh lifts, that's not a foul. It's only if that the bone lifts.
Great point, for sure.
Oh, sorry, it zoomed ahead on me.
Itchy fingers.
Frickin' technology. Okay, there.
Okay. We've talked about a true seated position, right? One unique aspect of this is athletes have some flexibility in how they would seat. And I think you can see that from these two athletes over here. The athlete on top is straddling both corners of this chair. But if you look at his legs, the inside of his leg is in intimate contact with the side of the seat. So if you think about the knees coming away from the chair, this still meets the criteria. He is sitting fully seated. The same way for the young man there in the bottom one, he's straddling just one corner, but the back of his knees are up against the side of the chair in that position. Most athletes will use straps to kind of maintain that position. But in reality, this is a really stable position, especially for athletes who don't have a whole lot of trunk and their stability is a little bit off. putting them inside that position really gets them to be stable and allows them to perhaps perform a little better. I think this is, yeah, okay. Watch this gentleman right here on the left.
Ladies and gentlemen, next track of the league. I should be done at the top.
Okay, one more time, Louise. Watch his buttocks. You can see his buttocks came almost completely off the chair. He didn't strap himself down very well. You can go ahead and just click on that black. That is a typical lifting foul, pretty obvious one actually. And you can see in this still that was taken from the video that his right hand side, the buttock is completely off the seat. He rotated over and he's putting pressure and keeping his left buttocks pretty much on the seat, but the right hand side comes way up off the chair, and that would be a red flag. And that official that's standing right there is in a pretty fair position to call some of those fouls. Watch his buttocks. One more time, Louise. Now go ahead and, yeah, that's not a lifting foul. What you see where the yellow arrow is in that still picture, you can see the top picture is when he's seated prior to him beginning his throw. And you can see on the right-hand side, the fleshy part of his buttocks actually comes up off the chair, but it hasn't come so far up where the bony prominence of his pelvis has elevated up off the chair. So this is actually not a lifting foul and would have been called a legal throw.
Yeah, so
there may be other issues with this throw, but in terms of lifting of the buttocks.
Yeah, let's just watch
that's how
that
we
video
consider
one
that.
more time.
Yeah, please.
Jerry, what about his knees?
That's what I was referring to, David. Yeah, I'll get to that because there's another picture coming up next. Yeah, go ahead and run it one more time, Louise.
Oh, sorry.
So watch the gentleman's knees now too. He does preparatory phase of the throw, left knee goes forward. Left knee goes way forward, away from the seat of the chair. That in and of itself is a lifting foul, but his buttocks were fine. Go ahead.
So,
thanks, Kevin.
To me, that's something to point out is, and I've seen somebody call lifting, I'm thinking, you know what? Okay, so this guy, he's barely strapped in. Yeah, he can lift. So look at how this guy's strapped in.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
it's pretty difficult for him to lift. If he would have an additional strap here, which he'd be allowed, again, practically impossible for him to lift. So you also got to be watching for their strapping. If they're strapped down pretty tight, odds are they're not going to be any lifting. If they're strapped like this, you better watch them because odds are good they are going to lift.
Okay. Question here is, does this athlete lift? Watch everything and see what you think.
15 seconds.
Time.
One more time.
15 seconds.
Okay. And the answer is yes. And if you look at this still, during the preparatory phase of the throw, you can see she rotates extensively. And her left ischial tuberosity and her buttock comes up off the seat of the chair. She's quite elevated. That would be a lifting fail. So the call and the lifting doesn't only take place during the process of the throw, of going forward with the throw and follow through. it can happen during the preparatory phase of the throw, which makes it somewhat difficult for us to be able to figure out where do I need to be in position to see all of this at the same time.
Hence you watch them during warm-up.
Yep, that's exactly why you do it. Does this athlete lift? Go ahead and run it. Yeah, go ahead and run it one more time if you would, Louise. One thing about this athlete, and you can see in the still picture, you look, watch him, you'll see in the left-hand side, you can see the fleshy part of his buttock is well placed on the chair. In reality, this gentleman does not have very much trunk control, and he sits in a very slouched position, which tilts his pelvis back. And all that fleshy part gets on the chair. And when he throws, basically all he does is he sits up straight, like your mom used to tell you at the kitchen table all the time, right? He sits up straight, he does not lift. It's a tough call to make, but in this particular case, and I think the video adequately demonstrates it, he really doesn't lift.
Well, and look, they got enough people watching there, they should know.
Hopefully so. Watch the knees.
One more time.
Yeah. Okay, watch when he brings his arm back.
Yeah, there's the chair, there's his knee.
Right. So what happens is he's a right-handed thrower. He rotates his trunk during the preparatory phase and comes back and extends as much as he can. And what happens is, since your spine is connected to your pelvis, the left knee, your pelvis rotates and the left knee moves forward, because although he has straps on top of his knees, he doesn't have anything in front to keep the knees from moving around in the chair. And as you can see in the still over here, that left knee during the preparatory phase of the throw is way out in front. And this would be a lifting call. Very, very commonly seen. Partly the athletes may not have been trained well enough, and partly I don't think some coaches have the experience to really understand what they need to do to get their athletes in a position to not fail in this way, foul in this way, I should say.
Club throw is an interesting one, and we do have a few of them in Canada. So it can be thrown in any manner. So you can see the implement up here. It looks kind of like a bowling pin, and they hold on to it by the little knob at the top, because they have difficulty holding on to any other implement. So they have this club so that it's easier for them to hang on to it, so that they can throw it forward, or they can throw it backwards. And a lot of them throw exactly like this athlete is. They're sitting with their back to the sector and they throw overhead.
It's a really functional way to throw, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And same rules apply as far as the chair. They have to have the contact with the back, the seat and the knee. Obviously, they're not going to lift with their buttocks because they're going backwards.
Yeah.
Again, like I said before, sliding along the seat, as long as you don't lose contact, is okay. The other thing to remember is, if you are judging a club throw, you want to be very careful, because the control is not there. I've seen these come up over the top of the edge of the cage. I've seen it that the second you hand them the implement, they're not waiting for the officials to get out of the way. They're throwing it. You got to be really, really careful when you're doing this event. I got a video.
You want me to take this, or you got it, Louise?
So yeah, he is tied down pretty good. There's no lifting at all.
Yeah. Notice he's straddling the seat too.
this one was. Again, tied in pretty good. And again, difficult to lift going backwards, but. This one cooperated. Go ahead.
So what would be your call? Go ahead and run it again, please. And go ahead and click on the space to the right of the picture. Yeah, there it is. So as you can see on the right, you can lift throwing backwards. It's not something we all necessarily think about. But what happens is she does not have her waist or her pelvis strapped down like one might normally do. She's well strapped with her knees and everything, and that's fine. But even throwing backwards with that huge extension, which is the benefit of that throwing that way, her buttocks come clearly off the ground completely. And that would be a lifting foul.
I guess what I was looking for this time, because I've watched this several times now, does she lift before the implement landed? Yeah, she lifts immediately. So it's definitely before the implement landed.
Oh, yeah, right.
Oh, yeah. Good thing to remember is that if there is a record set, 3 judges must sign for a world record for a para athlete. And same thing applies as any other athlete that you impound the implement and it must be reweighed. So the biggest thing that I wanted to point out here is 3 judges must sign. So therefore 3 judges better go out there and look to make sure that they've read the tape so that they can legally sign.
Well said.
That's the end of our presentation. Any questions? I did see one in the chat from Lynn asking about the rule books. Right now, World Para Athletics has gone through a change with the vast majority of their staff. And so getting everything accomplished in a timely manner is proving difficult for them. So the rule books, they haven't even been the rules haven't even been finalized, let alone gone to print yet. So we have absolutely no idea when it's going to happen.
Thank you.
You bet.
Janet and Tim, got a question?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. It's one of the best ones I've watched. And the only thing is, I hope that we can get a copy of this so we can watch it again, because there are so many questions that, you know, we've been around the block a few times, but there are still some questions. And I guess my biggest question is, we had the ability to watch some of these lifts 4, 5, 6 times, but not in a track meet. You get to only see it once. How many times have there been jury of appeals that has overruled the decision of a judge and referee on this lifting? Is it something that happens all the time, or are we sensible?
It is probably the biggest problem.
Oh, go ahead, Louise.
It's probably the biggest problem that we have in World Para Athletics is judging lifting, because it's kind of a judgment call. And like you say, we watched it 3 or 4 times to say, oh yeah, for sure, that's what happened. So a couple of things. One, that's why you want as many people out there as judging. You watch them during their warm-ups. You pick the ideal spot to see this is what I'm seeing, and you're assigning different officials to watch everything. But still, there's no guarantee that you're going to catch it. As technology progresses, there's more and more use of video. Again, not always that video is in the right position to see it, but it's coming. Again, as with everything we do as officials, we do the best we can.
Yeah, I was overruled on a call on lifting in Tokyo, and it took the video referee to find my error. So it happens, you know. It's like, well, it's a judgment call, right? Like many of the things that we do as officials, they're judgment calls, and we're not perfect. We try our best to be so, of course, and be experienced, but it doesn't always work. So it's nice to have backup and keep us on the straight and narrow.
Now, Jerry, I just want to congratulate you on the excellence of your presentation. It's marvelous the way you use English to explain it to us poor people.
Well, this was a group effort, but thank you very much. Yeah, we've worked long and hard to be able to do something that for years we said, you know, we really need to start pulling together videos and things like that and pictures so that we can show people what we're talking about. And fortunately, you know, David and I and Louise and other colleagues are starting to put together, you know, presentations like this so that we can train new officials and train those that are, you know, interested in becoming para officials and be able to kind of step right in with a little bit more idea of what they're really looking for. But
Yeah,
you know,
this might be
compliment.
this might be something that chief judges could use an hour and a half before an event starts.
You're absolutely right. In fact, I'm sitting down here in Phoenix, Arizona at the World Para Athletics Grand Prix, and I have a officials teaching session here coming up on Thursday before competition starts, and that's exactly what I'm going to be doing.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, it's great, and I'm excited to have been invited to help do these presentations for all my good friends up there in Canada. It's exciting, and thank you very much.
Can we get a copy of this recording?
No. But
It is being recorded, though.
but we are as Jerry's alluded to, we are in the process of trying to make more of this stuff readily available to everybody. Again, I mean, this PowerPoint is massive, right? It's not something that's easily shareable with all the pictures and with all the video. But again, it's a work in progress. I mean, Canada is been struggling trying to get ahead of our education, but we're making leaps and bounds, but we still got a ways to go. One day we will have all of this available.
Serge, is this recording going to be made available on your organization's website?
Yes,
Okay.
that's what I want just to say to Tim. Yes, all the video or all the webinar we did since 2 years will be posted on the new website of Athletic Canada. And now we're transferring all the video to a place that we'll be able to share to everyone.
Oh,
They will be available.
Lynn, did you have a question?
I did. Going back to the F visually impaired.
Mhm.
So just clarify, do they do 6 throws at a time if they need to
Nope.
be set up with their assistant, or do they
Nope.
competitor
they throw just-
1, competitor 2?
Yeah, they throw just like able-bodied. The only people that do 6 consecutive throws is seated athletes,
Okay,
mainly because of the time constraints of getting them tied down. That's the majority of the time, is getting the chairs tied down, getting them
Yeah,
tied down.
yeah.
Everybody else is business as usual.
So
I was just going to say, interestingly, when you're looking at having an athlete complete all 6 throws, when you're scheduling, it takes at least 15 minutes to do that, because there's a certain time limit that they're allowed to have to do warm-ups and things like that. So you add 6 minutes of throwing time, and you add 5 minutes of warm-up time and the time it takes to get strapped in and stuff like that, it adds up. So seated throws takes a while when you have a lot of athletes.
In there.
Yeah, we did the Ontario Para Sports Games on the weekend. And
Oh.
it was at a high school here in Mississauga. And we had 38 athletes competing, not all in throws,
Mhm.
but it was interesting because they did a try it at the lunch break. And there was a little guy, probably 9 years old, up on a throwing frame for the first time. And he was throwing, because it faced the 401, which is a big highway. He was going to throw. They asked him how far he thought he'd throw. He was throwing 1 kilometer away.
Good
So
for
it
you.
it kind of lightened up the day to see these young kids just trying this, and they may be our future Paralympians.
Yeah, amen.
Yep.
Two things. When we did the para section for Canada Games in Winnipeg 4 or 5 years ago, the seated competition went a lot smoother because we had 2 circles side by side.
It doesn't happen very often.
No, that's the trouble. But if you can
Yeah,
get 2 circles side by side, you can have person 2 setting up in the second circle while person 1 is competing.
Yeah, that was
And
awesome the way that went. But yeah,
and it
very rare.
decreases the stress of everybody.
Mhm.
Yeah, amen. We here in the United States, gosh, it's been probably 6 years now. Had long lines of athletes at a big competition, and we just said, well, what if we put 2 circles together, and we have maybe 1 or extra person on the officiating team, and a couple of people can help get the other athletes situated, and you just go back and forth. And it was like, whoa, what a difference it made, right?
Second thing, if an athlete, how do I put this? If an athlete shows signs of multiple disabilities, but how do they decide to classify them as X instead of Y?
That's a great
That's a
question.
question for classifiers, not for us.
Don't try and sneak out of it, Louise.
Well, okay, Jerry lives with a classifier. He
My
might
wife's
be
an
able to answer
international
that.
classifier, so we talk about this once in a while. Basically, when you do classification and it turns out to be you have multiple impairments, not necessarily the disability, but the impairment as a result of the disability.
My mistake in the wording, sorry.
Oh, no, it's a complex thing. Don't worry about it. You essentially wind up, the athlete has to choose. So if gosh, what's a good example? An athlete might be, might have a spinal cord injury, and that puts him in the 50s classes, but he's also visually impaired, right? So which way does he go? I mean, basically, he has a choice. He can be put into different classes, and there are variations on that theme. And it's hard to do. That's why the classifiers go through a lot of training and are such experts.
But would it come down to the classifiers saying that you could be approved for classification X or classification Y? Choose?
Yeah, the most common decision there is an amputee who decides they want to throw seated because they're not really stable enough to stand still and throw standing up. It's just the functional limitation of their unique amputation.
Yeah,
So they could be put into a seated class. And that would be a personal decision on their part in conjunction with the classifiers and their coaches.
And you see that quite often, that
Yeah.
half the athletes in the seated throws walk up to the chair on their own steam and get in there.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
one point too is you can't use adaptive devices to support yourself while you're standing in a circle and throw it. So you couldn't use a walker for, say, to be able to lean on while you threw. So that's not allowed. You have to be perfectly stable on your own recognizance in order to throw. So from an amputee standpoint, or someone in the 40s class, which is amputee-like in their function, they would choose to be a seated thrower instead, because they can sit down and throw. And they have all that trunk and coordination that some others might not have. So it's to their advantage to make that decision.
Yeah, no, I was just curious whether this was a top-down or a bottom-up decision.
Yeah, no, well, sometimes, occasionally it does get forced upon them, but usually it's a decision made by the athlete and their parents, if they're young, or the athlete and their coach. And the classifiers kind of give them the information and say, okay, here's your choices. That sort of thing.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great pickup. That's a wonderful question. I don't think I've ever had anybody ask that. It's wonderful.
Okay, Janet and Tim?
Yeah, just two quick ones, and I think the answer is obvious. One of them was the assistant helping a seated athlete. They have to wait until the throw is over. So we're now looking for a red or a white flag. Is that what you're saying there? Before you allow somebody in to help?
Louise?
Sorry, you talking about, they don't for a seated throw or for a ambulatory?
It was after they were oriented.
It was after they've been oriented.
Oh, no. So they can come into the circle or the area, orientate them. And once they feel that they're orientated, then they step out. Now, if they lose orientation, then they're allowed to step back in. You stop the clock. But once the throw is completed, so again, think of able-bodied. So when that athlete would normally turn to walk out, right? So then once they get out, then that assistant is there to help them out of the area.
Okay, that was one. What was the other one?
About the prosthetic.
Oh, okay. We are jumps people, and we have done a lot of one-legged jumpers. Have you ever seen a one-legged thrower? I have not.
Yeah, sure, all the time.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I
Sure,
must
I
need
mean,
to-
I have seen fewer bilateral amputees throw, but I've certainly seen a lot of one-legged. They wear a prosthetic limb. It's got a flex foot on it, like you see the runners. It stabilizes them, gives them balance, and they throw like any other ambulatory athlete.
There
I'm
was one in
sorry.
one of our presentations. We have got a
What?
Canadian. I think he's medaled actually in world competitions. We
Yeah,
have a one-legged.
I led you there. What I'm talking about, I think I heard it said that you may or may not use the prosthetic.
Oh, okay.
I'm
Sorry if I
asking, have you ever
confused
seen
you.
one who did not use the prosthetic?
In high jump? Yeah.
No, high jump, yes. I'm talking about throws. And that's what
Oh.
I heard. I thought I heard.
Gotcha. No.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I misunderstood your question. My apologies.
That's okay.
But the thing, Tim, the thing would be if you've got somebody who could qualify for amputee, not wanting to throw wearing the prosthetic, they'd be doing throws seated.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right.
They wouldn't be doing the standing throws.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
they
no,
were talking about ambulatory, and I thought I heard you could or could not, your choice, use your prosthetic. And I just wondered, had you ever seen one? I haven't.
Yeah, I think it's a general rule of thumb that it's a general rule that in a field event, the athletes have a choice, whereas in track, they do not.
Yeah, I guess not.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sort of obvious, huh?
I watched in '76 a Japanese athlete lose his in the 100. It
Oh,
wasn't
really?
pretty.
Yeah, for sure. It used to be that we required the athlete to put their prosthesis back on, and they weren't allowed to hop to the finish line. But now we do. In other words, if it falls off, they can pick it up and hop across the finish line if they just need a time. Obviously, they're probably going to lose the race, but if they need a time to move forward, then they're allowed to do that.
This guy couldn't put his back on. I think he was out cold.
Yeah.
I saw one at high school provincials. The anchor runner was wearing a prosthetic and he lost it during the race and he wiped out. The prosthetic took out another team. He was just ugly.
Yeah.
Incidental. Come on.
Sorry. Thank you so much.
You guys have been so great. Thank you so much for all the wonderful questions.
Oh, it was great.
Yeah, no, this has been a great presentation. Thank you both. And all the technical background to put the thing together.
Okay, and officially, on behalf of the World Para Athletics Event Group, I want to thank both Louise and Jerry for an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Our
Thanks,
pleasure.
David.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
David, talk to you tomorrow.
Yeah,
Okay,
okay.
Thanks, Louise.
good
My
night.
pleasure.
Thanks.